Many people mistakenly believe that Alexander Akimov was the one who pressed the AZ-5 button on the night of April 26, 1986, at Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. However, it was Leonid Toptunov, the senior reactor control engineer, who had only been in that position for 2 months and was just 25 years old. Despite his promising future, Toptunov's actions resulted in the explosion at Chernobyl. Toptunov was raised in Chernobyl, a village located in the Zhytomyr Oblast of Ukraine, surrounded by scientists and soldiers. His father was a high-ranking military officer who oversaw the Soviet Union's space program. At 7 months old, Toptunov witnessed Yuri Gagarin's first space flight. When he was 13, he moved to Tallinn, Estonia, as his father became an attaché at the Dvigatel rocket engine plant. Toptunov retained his knowledge of physics and mathematics from his time around the scientists of the Soviet space program. Toptunov had a natural talent for mathematics and enrolled in the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute at the age of 16. Despite nearly being expelled early on, he completed the 4-year atomic power plant engineering program. He chose to focus on a diploma project that used acoustics to identify irregularities in the performance of RBMK reactors. Toptunov was then transferred to Chernobyl Unit 4, which was still under construction, and worked his way up through the ranks, participating in the reactor's quality control. Once Unit 4 was launched, Toptunov decided to pursue a career as a senior reactor control engineer. This required months of studying for safety exams, health checks, and security screenings by the KGB. By February 1986, Toptunov was a senior reactor control engineer, almost 3 years after he first arrived at Chernobyl. Outside of the power plant, Toptunov set up a gym in his dormitory and ran a physics and mathematics class at one of the many schools in the city of Pripyat. Toptunov was aware of one of the many forgotten oddities about the reactor following one of the safety exams. He remarked that some documents refer to a power increase when the control rods were inserted in certain configurations instead of reducing power as they should have. On April 25, 1986, the day of the scheduled shutdown of Unit 4, Toptunov was scheduled to work the night shift before and afterward. On the first shift, Toptunov was in charge of lowering the reactor power down in preparation for the experiment. He began at 1 a.m., down from 3,100 megawatts of power, and stabilizing at 1,600 by the end of the shift. It was at this time that Toptunov was first accused of making a mistake, although he wasn't at fault. As the power output decreased, xenon started to build up in the reactor, leading to reactor poisoning. In order to maintain a steady power level, Toptunov started to remove control rods. When the Scala computer generated its report on the reactor parameters that morning, it indicated a reading of 13.2, which was below the minimum permissible operating reactivity margin of 15. However, the actual operating reactivity margin was 18, but this information was not properly communicated during the daily briefing. The regulations stipulated that if the Scala system showed an operating reactivity margin below 15 rods, even if it was just a computational error, the reactor should have been shut down immediately. However, the senior workers disregarded this rule since the reactor was already scheduled to be shut down later that day. This regulation was considered a mere formality, and Toptunov received only a minor reprimand from Alexander Kovalenko, the head of the reactor shop, who asked him to provide an explanatory note the following morning for allowing the operating reactivity margin to drop so low. Toptunov went home to rest before his night shift and his upcoming short vacation. However, as he was getting ready for work, he was informed that the reactor had not been shut down and that he would be responsible for conducting the shutdown with Unit 4. Toptunov tried to persuade his friend Alexander Korol to join him so that Korol could observe the shutdown, but Korol declined. Toptunov ended up going to work alone. When Toptunov arrived, power was already being reduced to the final level before the turbine rundown program could begin. He conducted the handover smoothly, and the power continued down, lowering to 700 megawatts of thermal output, the minimum requirement for the turbine rundown program, and then falling below. It is still unclear as to why this actually occurred, but likely explanations include a heavy workload on Toptunov, workers trying to lower power to be able to disconnect the Hermine 8 from the reactor for vibration measurements without dumping steam, or Toptunov just losing control of the reactor. At 28 minutes past midnight on April 26, 1986, a series of computer errors caused Toptunov to lose control of Reactor 4, and the power plunged to as low as 30 megawatts of thermal output. Yuri Tregub was the first to start raising control rods, then Akimov, and finally Toptunov, the least experienced of the three. Dragan noticed that Toptunov was pulling the control rods unevenly, mostly from one half of the reactor. Seeing it as a teaching opportunity, Dragan guided Toptunov on what controllers to withdraw from the reactor. When the AZ5 button was pressed, the control rods began to descend, and the graphite displaced water at the bottom of the reactor, causing a power surge. In an instant, Toptunov watched the power initially decrease, and then jump from 230 megawatts to 320, and a second later climb again to 530. The noise filled the room, like a car engine struggling to start up, and then an explosion. A few panic cries, and then a second explosion. The lights failed momentarily as the power supply was lost, and then the diesel generators, a series of batteries, and inverters all came online to supply power once more. And that was it. With the push of one button, the thing he was supposed to do, Toptunov caused the explosion of Chernobyl Reactor 4. But was he at fault? After the explosion, Toptunov was one of the first to see that the control rods had only descended halfway into the reactor. Try as he might, he could not get them to descend any further. Unbeknownst to him, that was because they were no longer inside the reactor. They had been vaporized in the explosion. When the chief shift supervisor, Boris Rogozhkin, arrived at the control room, he immediately pressed the AZ5 button again and turned to Toptunov and Akimov, asking them what they had done. The outlaw defended Toptunov's actions, saying they had merely pressed AZ5 when the reactor had exploded. Rogozhkin turned to Toptunov and asked him directly if he had, which Toptunov confirmed. Rogozhkin left the control room, and the outlaw ordered Toptunov to leave the control room, but Toptunov, perhaps feeling guilt over the explosion, refused. Eventually, the outlaw forced him to at least move to the safety of Unit 3, where there was nothing he could do. But within minutes, he returned again. He was ordered to leave, but once more he came back, waiting for any orders to assist. By the morning, there was one task that he had been given to do alongside Akimov and Akif Yusakov and Olaf. They ascended to room 714/2, a narrow passageway with a series of valves that when opened would allow water to flow from the steam separators down to the reactor. The room was flooded with radioactive water, and the further into the room one traversed, the higher the radioactivity. Toptunov and Akimov were allocated to the far end and stood in ankle-deep water as more showered over them, using a miner's lamp for light, trying to open the valves. When they returned to the control room, it was obvious that they weren't going to be able to work much longer. They tried to explain their work to the day shift that had arrived from the control room while they were opening the valves, but this was impossible. Between sentences, they had to run to the bin to throw up until there was nothing left to do. So Akimov and Toptunov departed for the infirmary. Both Akimov and Toptunov were quickly whisked from the nuclear power plant to hospital number 126 in Pripyat, where Akimov recovered much more quickly. By the evening, Toptunov had developed a dark brown nuclear tan and was struggling to speak as his tongue was swollen. When asked about the operating reactivity margin, he said the least value he saw was 18. That evening, Toptunov joined the first of the extraordinary convoys transporting all of the most severely affected patients from hospital number 126 to Kiev, and then a charter flight to Moscow, where they would all undergo treatment at Moscow Hospital number 6. On April 29th, Toptunov sent a telegram to his parents in Estonia, saying, "Mama, I am in hospital. I feel okay." His parents set off for their son. The most pressing concern for Toptunov and other patients afflicted by acute radiation syndrome was restoring their white blood cell count, which would require a hematopoietic stem cell transplant. For many, no tissue matches could be found, but Toptunov was one of the exceptions. His mother, Vera Toptunova, was a viable donor match, and stem cells were taken from her and transplanted into her son. But it was never going to be enough. It was estimated that Toptunov had received 1,300 grams of radiation, almost 45 times the amount of radiation the average person in the United States will receive in their lifetime and twice what is considered to be a lethal dosage. Toptunov's condition deteriorated as he tried to determine what had happened. When his mother asked him how it happened, all Toptunov could reply with was, "Mama, I did everything right. I did everything according to the regulations." Toptunov's condition continued to deteriorate. On May 11th, the same day Akimov succumbed to his radiation dosage, Toptunov was struggling with the serious pain of hairs falling from his head, landing on open wounds. His mother suggested that he have his head shaved, but Toptunov declined, calling it a waste of money when he could just pull the hair out of his head so easily. On May 14th, Leonid Toptunov passed away. Radiation damage covered 90% of his skin, and his lungs were failing. He woke up gasping for breath and suffocated. The bone marrow procedure had not had enough time to work. He was just 25 years old. Toptunov's funeral was prepared at the Matino Cemetery in Moscow. His parents followed his body to the truck that would take him to his final resting place. But as soon as they began to seal his body inside the zinc coffin, they protested, wanting it only to be sealed before he was buried. The undertakers relented. When the Soviet Union was deciding who to blame, they included Toptunov, Akimov, and Pervushkin in the list alongside the 6 men who would be imprisoned for the disaster. They sent a letter to their families explaining how they were at fault and that if they hadn't died, they too would have been sent to prison. When the outlaw heard of this, he sent his own letter to Fyodor and Vera, proclaiming their son to be a hero and lamenting how the real criminals had got away with it while making the operators seem like troglodytes, as he put it. Toptunov's parents moved to Kiev, where they were told that the Soviet Union had planned to relocate the bodies. But shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the plans were scrapped. The first good news for the Toptunov family in years came in 2008 when Toptunov was publicly exonerated for his role in the Chernobyl disaster, and was instead posthumously awarded the Order of Courage 3rd degree for his bravery on the night of the accident. However, the medal was stolen sometime later. On April 26, 2010, exactly 24 years after the accident, Fyodor Toptunov passed away. Vera Toptunova is believed to still be alive today. Once Toptunov may have been publicly exonerated, there are still many who consider him guilty for the explosion. But is he? To answer that question, we must consider if what he did was the correct thing to do. If he did everything correctly, then he cannot be at fault. Did Toptunov cause the sudden loss of power? No, according to current stereotypic studies, including by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the loss of power was caused by a combination of measurement errors and what the outlaw would later describe as a faulty system normals raising the power in violation of procedure if it was done quickly enough, which was the case. Was Toptunov aware that he was violating the operating reactivity margin? No, he was not. The computer data that he used to stabilize the reactor showed an operating reactivity margin of 18 control rods. However, the automatic control rods were withdrawn to compensate for cold water fluctuation and xenon poisoning, which ultimately led to the violation of the operating reactivity margin. Did Toptunov know that pressing the AZ5 button would cause an explosion? No, he did not. Although he may have learned that inserting control rods could result in a power surge, it does not mean that he would have known that in this particular situation, a power surge would occur or that it could be so significant that it would cause the reactor to explode. In summary, Toptunov cannot be held solely responsible for the explosion as he followed the established procedures. However, this does not change the fact that he was the one who pressed the AZ5 button, and he will always be remembered as the man who caused the Chernobyl disaster.